These are the statistics that Minneapolis officials don't want to talk about when they celebrate their so-called recovery. While the mayor touts falling crime rates and rising police recruitment, the city's homicide rate remains more than triple the national average. While tourism officials celebrate record hotel bookings, downtown office vacancy sits at over 30%. While community leaders praise resilience, homeowners face the largest property tax increase in 16 years to cover the financial wreckage of a city still struggling to rebuild itself. Minneapolis wants you to believe it is back. The data tells a different story. On the surface, the numbers look encouraging. Violent crime dropped significantly in 2024. The police department added officers for the first time since the murder of George Floyd. Major conventions brought record-breaking crowds downtown. City leaders speak confidently about momentum and progress, painting a picture of a metropolis that has emerged stronger from its darkest chapter. But dig deeper into those same statistics, and a more troubling picture emerges. This is not a story about recovery. It is about a city learning to manage decline while calling it success. Let's start with the crime statistics everyone is celebrating. Yes, Minneapolis saw significant drops in many categories in 2024. Robberies fell 45%, carjackings dropped 39%, shots fired decreased 19%. These are not small improvements, they are dramatic reductions that would cause celebration in any city. The problem is where Minneapolis started from. Those impressive percentage drops are measured against the catastrophic crime surge that followed 2020. When the city had 94 homicides in 2021, the highest since the Murderapolis era of the 1990s, a drop to 76 homicides in 2024 sounds like progress. But 76 murders is still 58% higher than the 48 recorded in 2019, before the world knew George Floyd. The city's violent crime rate of 1,155 crimes per 100,000 residents tells the real story. That rate is more than 3 times higher than the state average and nearly twice the national average. For a city representing just 7% of Minnesota's population, Minneapolis accounts for 30% of the state's aggravated assaults, 46% of its murders, 56% of its robberies, and an astonishing 91% of its carjackings. This is not recovery, this is stabilization at a much higher baseline of violence than the city had before 2020. The police staffing situation reveals similar sleight of hand. Yes, Minneapolis added 76 new officers and 22 lateral transfers in 2024, marking the first time in years the department ended with more officers than it started with. Chief Brian O'Hara, hired from Newark in 2022, proclaimed that Minneapolis would be the greatest law enforcement comeback story in America. That optimism runs headlong into harsh mathematics. The department's sworn ranks dropped from 920 officers in March 2019 to a low of 560 in March 2024. Even with the 2024 gains, the force reached only 588 officers by mid-May. That is still a 40% reduction from pre-Floyd levels, leaving Minneapolis with one of the lowest officer-to-resident ratios in the nation, just 1.4 officers per 1,000 residents compared to a national average of 2.4. The human cost of this shortage is measured in overtime dollars and exhausted officers. The Minneapolis Police Department spent a record $28 million on overtime in 2024, exceeding its planned budget by $12 million and nearly quadrupling pre-2020 figures. One police lieutenant earned approximately $500,000 last year, with nearly half derived from overtime pay. 66 Minneapolis Police Department employees collected over $100,000 in overtime, with 11 exceeding $200,000. Individual investigators are handling caseloads higher than they have ever managed before, and individual officers are just doing more and more work, Chief Brian O'Hara told reporters. This is not sustainable policing. It is crisis management disguised as progress. The downtown recovery story follows the same pattern of selective statistics. Minneapolis tourism officials celebrated 2024 as a banner year, pointing to record-breaking hotel demand and high-profile events. The American Physical Society March meeting and Big Ten tournaments brought unprecedented crowds, with hotels selling 59,590 rooms in a single week, the most in city history. These events created genuine economic impact and showed that Minneapolis could still attract major gatherings. But they also masked the deeper structural problems plaguing the city's core. The office vacancy rate downtown stands at 30.8%, with some estimates reaching as high as 39.5%. To put that in perspective, a pair of office towers known as the Forum sold for $6.5 million in 2024, a more than 90% discount compared to their $74 million sale price in 2019. With 20 million square feet of vacant office space in the Twin Cities metro area, including more than 9 million in downtown Minneapolis, real estate experts estimate it would take nearly 30 years to fill all the empty buildings at current absorption rates. The University of Toronto study of 66 North American downtowns found Minneapolis ranking 64th in post-pandemic recovery, with only 56% of its 2019 foot traffic returning by late 2023. The financial implications of this commercial real estate collapse extend far beyond empty buildings. In 2020, residential properties made up just over 66% of Minneapolis property tax base. By 2024, that figure had jumped to over 71% as commercial property values cratered. Homeowners who paid 47.4% of the city's tax levy in 2023 now shoulder 51.6% of the burden. The result was the largest property tax increase in at least 16 years, an 8.1% hike from the city, with many homeowners seeing double-digit increases. The median owner-occupied home in Minneapolis, valued at $329,000, saw its city property taxes jump 11% to $2,098. The city has already planned another 10.8% increase for 2026. This is what managed decline looks like. Residents paying more for city services while receiving less, as the tax base shrinks and the remaining taxpayers absorb the difference. But perhaps the most telling aspect of Minneapolis' supposed recovery is how little it has addressed the underlying racial disparities that exploded into national view during the 2020 protests. The Minnesota paradox, the state's reputation for progressive values coexisting with some of the nation's worst racial inequality, remains as stark as ever. The numbers are devastating. The median black family in the Twin Cities earns $38,178 annually, less than half the $84,459 earned by the median white family. Minnesota ranks second nationally in income inequality between blacks and whites, trailing only Washington, D.C. The black poverty rate of 25.4% is more than 4 times the white rate of 5.9%. Homeownership rates tell an even starker story. About 3/4 of white families in the Twin Cities own homes, compared to only 1/4 of black families. There is a 36 percentage point gap between households of color that own homes versus white households. Only 1% of Minnesota businesses are owned by people who identify as black or African American. Homeownership remains a central fault line. These disparities are not accidents of market forces. They are the product of deliberate policies that became institutionalized over decades. Historic black neighborhoods were destroyed after World War II to make way for Interstate 94. Brutal redlining practices by real estate brokers and lenders locked black families out of wealth-building opportunities. The Ku Klux Klan organized actively in Minneapolis during the 1920s, and violence was regularly used to intimidate black residents, including the unruly mob of 4,000 people who surrounded a family's home in South Minneapolis in 1931. By the 1990s, good liberal whites were outraged by the widening racial gaps, but the damage was done. As University of Minnesota professor Samuel Myers Jr. noted, when racism becomes institutionalized, you do not need individual racists for there to be structural racism. 5 years after George Floyd's murder sparked a global movement for racial justice, these fundamental inequalities remain largely unchanged. The protests may have ended, but the conditions that created them persist. The Lake Street corridor, which bore the brunt of the 2020 unrest, illustrates both the progress and the limitations of Minneapolis recovery efforts. The civil unrest resulted in $500 million in damage to 1,500 buildings, making it the second costliest civil disturbance in U.S. history after the 1992 Los Angeles riots. The Lake Street Council alone estimated $250 million in damages along that corridor. An estimated $100 million in mostly private donations and millions more in insurance funds have gone into rebuilding Lake Street. The Minneapolis Foundation, McKnight Foundation, Mortensen Construction, Cargill, and others have spent $7 million helping 98 Lake Street business owners. New developments have risen from the ashes, and some blocks show genuine signs of renewal. Rebuilding is visible in some places, but not everywhere. But drive down Lake Street today, and you will still see vacant lots where buildings once stood. The burned-out husk of the 3rd Precinct Station remains surrounded by fencing, with cleanup supposedly beginning in 2024, though construction has not started. George Floyd Square, the intersection where George Floyd was murdered, remains a complex memorial space where the city struggles to balance commemoration with traffic flow. Vacant blocks remain a reminder of the work left to do. Construction on the square's permanent redesign will not begin until after the 5th anniversary of George Floyd's murder in May 2025. And even then, the city is recommending a flexible, open concept that would keep vehicular traffic in the intersection while allowing streets to be closed for events. It is a compromise solution that satisfies no one completely, much like the city's broader approach to post-2020 recovery. Compromise is the political reality. The youth crime statistics reveal another troubling dimension of Minneapolis challenges. More than half of Minneapolis school students are chronically absent, missing 10% or more of the school year. That absenteeism rate is well above the national average and is even higher among black students. Authorities have noted with alarm that younger teenagers and children are committing more serious crimes. In September 2024, a 10-year-old boy was charged with car theft. Youth issues are central to the city's future. Among Minneapolis homicides where the offender's age is known, about 10% are committed by children under 18, and roughly 40% by those under 24. This is not just about policing or criminal justice. It is about a generation of young people growing up in a city where opportunity remains unequally distributed and where hope is often in short supply. Unequal burdens are shaping everyday life. The federal oversight situation adds another layer of uncertainty to Minneapolis's future. After years of investigation following Floyd's murder, the Department of Justice under President Biden negotiated a comprehensive consent decree to oversee the Minneapolis Police Department reforms. The agreement, approved by the City Council in January 2025, would have provided federal monitoring and enforcement of constitutional policing standards. But on May 21, 2025, the Trump administration's Department of Justice withdrew from the federal consent decree, writing that the United States no longer believes the proposed consent decree would be in the public interest. The department argued that the Biden administration's approach sought to subject Minneapolis police to sweeping arguments that went beyond accusations of unconstitutional conduct, and that it would have led to years of micromanagement. Mayor Jacob Frey's response was defiant. He said, "We are doing it anyway. We will implement every reform outlined in the consent decree because accountability is not optional." On June 10, 2025, Frey signed Executive Order 2025-01, requiring city leaders to implement all reforms from the proposed federal consent decree that do not conflict with the existing state agreement. This leaves Minneapolis in an unusual position, voluntarily implementing federal police reforms without federal oversight or enforcement mechanisms. The city now relies primarily on its settlement agreement with the Minnesota Department of Human Rights and the independent monitoring organization Effective Law Enforcement for All. Reports from Effective Law Enforcement for All have been encouraging, noting that Minneapolis has made more progress toward building a foundation for sustainable reform in the first year of monitoring than nearly any other jurisdiction operating under court-ordered reform agreements. But voluntary compliance is different from mandated oversight, especially when police culture and community trust remain fragile. The population trends tell their own story about Minneapolis's appeal. The 2024 census estimated 428,579 people in Minneapolis, essentially unchanged from the 429,983 counted in 2020. But that surface stability masks deeper instability. The 2023 estimate showed only 425,142 people, a decline of almost 5,000 from the previous year. More telling is the demographic breakdown. The population of children between ages 7 and 17 living in Minneapolis and St. Paul has dropped by more than 6% since before the pandemic. Hennepin County, which includes Minneapolis, lost nearly 23,000 people between 2020 and 2024. These are not just statistics. They represent families making calculated decisions about where to raise children and build futures. The contrast with Minneapolis's aspirations is stark. The city's 2040 comprehensive plan envisions adding 233,000 new residents by mid-century, driven by dense development and transit-oriented growth. That plan assumes a city attractive enough to draw people from across the region and nation. Current population trends suggest that assumption may be wishful thinking. Yet there are genuine bright spots in Minneapolis's recovery story. The transformation of Winter Gas Station from the notorious murder station to a safe community space shows what focused intervention can accomplish. Once the site of 38 shootings in 2021 alone, the area saw just one shooting in 2024. The rate of unsheltered homelessness in Hennepin County decreased 14% in 2024, even as many cities see dramatic increases. Downtown apartment leasing has actually surged, with renters signing leases on 4,800 apartments in the first half of 2024, the most in a decade. This suggests that while commercial real estate struggles, residential demand remains strong, particularly among young professionals who prefer urban living and are not deterred by office vacancy rates. The tourism sector's record-breaking performance in 2024 demonstrated Minneapolis' continued ability to host major events and attract visitors. From the American Physical Society convention to both Big Ten basketball tournaments, the city showed it could still compete for high-profile gatherings that bring national attention and economic impact. But these successes exist within a larger framework of managed decline and lowered expectations. The recovery narrative obscures fundamental questions about Minneapolis' future trajectory. Is this a temporary setback before renewed growth, or a permanent adjustment to a new reality of higher crime, lower commercial property values, and continued racial inequality? The answer likely depends on factors beyond local control. The broader transformation of American downtowns in the post-pandemic era affects every major city. Remote work has fundamentally altered demand for office space. Retail patterns shifted even before 2020. Urban crime increases have followed similar patterns in cities across the nation, often correlating with police-community tensions following high-profile incidents. Minneapolis' situation reflects national trends, but it also reflects choices made by local leaders and residents. The decision to voluntarily implement police reforms without federal enforcement shows commitment to accountability. The continued investment in Lake Street rebuilding demonstrates resilience. The tourism sector's success proves the city retains significant assets and appeal. At the same time, persistent racial disparities show how difficult it is to change deeply embedded systems of inequality. The commercial real estate crisis illustrates the limits of municipal power when facing broader economic forces. The police staffing crisis demonstrates the long-term consequences of broken trust between law enforcement and communities. The story of Minneapolis since 2020 is not really about recovery, it is about adaptation. The city is learning to function with fewer police officers, higher crime rates, more vacant office buildings, and greater residential tax burdens. It is finding ways to celebrate tourism successes while managing downtown decline. It is implementing police reforms while struggling to rebuild community trust. This adaptation has allowed Minneapolis to avoid complete collapse and maintain essential services. Crime rates, while still elevated, are not spiraling out of control. The police department, while understaffed, is slowly rebuilding. Downtown, while struggling, still hosts major events and attracts residents. But adaptation is not the same as progress, and stabilization is not the same as success. Minneapolis today is a smaller, more expensive, more dangerous city than it was 5 years ago. The recovery narrative helps residents and leaders maintain optimism, but it also risks obscuring the magnitude of the challenges ahead. The real test for Minneapolis will not be whether it can maintain current trends, but whether it can reverse them. Can the city rebuild its police force to adequate levels while maintaining reform momentum? Can it revitalize its downtown commercial core while keeping residential neighborhoods affordable? Can it address racial disparities that have persisted for generations? The answers to these questions will determine whether Minneapolis's story becomes one of genuine renewal or merely successful adaptation to decline. The statistics suggest that for now, the city has chosen stability over transformation, managing problems rather than solving them. That may be the most honest assessment possible. 5 years after the murder of George Floyd thrust Minneapolis onto the world stage, the city has avoided the worst-case scenarios while falling short of the best-case hopes. It is a story of survival, resilience, and the complex realities of urban governance in 21st century America. Whether that is enough depends on what you expected from a city that briefly became the center of a global movement for justice and change. The protests have ended, the headlines have moved on, but Minneapolis continues the difficult work of becoming something different than what it was, even if no one is quite sure yet what that something is.